I'm Dan Coney. I'm a member of the board of Mount Wilson, sort of involved in, well, it's a very activist board. We're all involved with a lot of stuff. We have to be, because we need to. So these events help us and help get the word out of who we are and help give us a lot of exposure. Tell your friends, tell everybody, and especially if you enjoy it, and I'm sure you will tonight. Okay. Now, our talk tonight is clearly with the women scientists at Mount Wilson in the early years. Now, this is sort of where Eun-Joo Ahn here is probably the person who knows the most now about the early history of Mount Wilson, as well as probably more than that, but that's what I talked to her about. And she's been doing research since 2017. She's been in the Huntington Library and found Mount Wilson logbooks and stuff that they didn't even know they had, that they are now digitizing for us. She's really gotten into the weeds, into the fine details of stuff, and so it's going to be a great talk and educational for all of us. Okay, thank you very much. Here's Eun-Joo Ahn. Thank you.
I am so happy to be back here to Mount Wilson after it's nearly 3 years since I've been here. And everybody up on the mountain, people at Carnegie Observatories, Mount Wilson Institute, the volunteers, you all helped me so much. So I'm very, very happy and honored that I can finally contribute to some of the histories of Mount Wilson Observatory. And like Dan said, I was first an astrophysicist at University of Chicago, Department of Astronomy and Astrophysics. And very interestingly, I did not know about George Ellery Hale when I was there. I did not know Mount Wilson Observatory was here. I thought it was somewhere in New Mexico or Arizona. And it's only after I came to Santa Barbara to study history of science did I know that George Ellery Hale was the first professor of astrophysics at University of Chicago. He founded Mount Wilson Observatory, which is on the San Gabriel Mountains here. So it was really ironic to become more familiar with the University of Chicago, Yerkes Observatory, Mount Wilson Observatory after I left Chicago. So this is a picture of 4 women sitting, and it comes from a photo album of Phoebe Waterman Haas. And it's taken at Mount Wilson, most likely outside somewhere where you walked towards here in 1910. And this was taken during the 4th meeting of the International Union for Cooperation in Solar Research. And it's labeled the 4 Friends here. And if we just, it's taken in the 1910s, we moved this 100 years to the future. We changed the dresses and their hairstyle, and it could really be a photograph of 4 graduate students or 4 young scientists taking a break during a conference that was held in a very hot and dusty place. Like, they're exhausted. They probably have the program of the conference for the day, looking at, okay, what talks next? Do we need to go in there, or can we skip the talk, maybe? So I was really delighted and surprised when I first came across this photograph, because it gave me another viewpoint, another perspective towards this famous conference. So these 4 women were what's known as human computers. So when we say the word computer today, we usually think of the sleek machine. But in the 19th century, turn of the 20th century, computers were usually humans who were carrying out all the computing work, the calculations. And in astronomy, as people were using photographs or even visual observations, trying to calculate minute positions or trying to measure the position of the lines of the spectrums, they really needed a lot of calculations, computing to do. So initially in Europe, they hired men but they were not, you have to pay a lot more, and somehow they were not very well suited in various ways, and then people started hiring younger men who just graduated from high school or universities. And later they moved on to hiring educated women, and that was the trend in the US. And perhaps the most well-published known examples are Edward Pickering and Harvard College Observatories, his assistants. So when we read about astronomical history and we read the stellar classifications, the OB, AF, GKM, those classifications came from Harvard, and it was the woman assistants such as Annie Jump Cannon or Williamina Fleming who worked out those classifications. So those are the woman computers. And my talk will be about some of the women computers that worked at Mount Wilson Observatory. So going back to this conference in 1910, so for those of us who are interested in the history of Mount Wilson Observatory, we are aware that there was this famous conference in 1910. And this is perhaps the most well-circulated, well-known photograph from that meeting. So George Ellery Hale, who founded this observatory, also proposed that there should be some international organization where scientists can cooperate in solar research. So he proposed that, and the first meeting of this IUCSR was held in 1905, and this was the fourth meeting. And this meeting was quite important to Mount Wilson Observatory, Pasadena, Mount Wilson, because many scientists, famous prominent scientists from the East Coast and Europe came and actually visited Pasadena and hiked upward, rode a burro or took a motor car up Mount Wilson. And it brought this place to prominence. So Mount Wilson became known amongst the scientific community, and also the local regional press loved it. They took every opportunity they could about famous scientists coming, and they very generously reported on what was happening at the conference. It's like Southern California, Pasadena, this is the scientific center. Like, see how great we are. We are better than you, like you Northern Californians. There was this kind of rivalry going on at the time for reals. So we know who participated in this meeting, and who are these people in the photographs, because there's this label and we can match people. And when we look at this picture, there's two women. You can see them. So one is this Mrs. Williamina Fleming, who was instrumental in doing the alphabetical stellar classification. So she was there as the capacity of the expert. So her boss, Edward Pickering, did all the talking, but he could always refer to her. Like, she did all these, she looked into the spectral lines, so she did all the classification, so there's an expert. And Mrs. Kapteyn accompanied her husband, Jacobus Kapteyn, who's here, and Kapteyn and George Ellery Hale had this cooperation going on for a number of years. So every summer, Kapteyn would visit Mount Wilson for a couple of months. He came by himself the first year, but afterwards, from 1909 onwards, he always came with his wife. So we have these two women, and when I saw this picture, I thought, oh, so maybe this was only for men, and these two are exceptions. But when we look at the participants list, there are about 86 participants, and there are 6 women scientists from Mount Wilson Observatory who participated. But I was still wondering, maybe they put all the scientific staff, because computers were classified as scientific staff. And these women were not allowed to come up the mountain, and maybe they just participated in some of the social functions down in the valley. So I was wondering about that, and Phoebe Waterman-Haas's photo album just quashed all those questions, and I could change my question from, did these women scientists really participate, to what did these women scientists do at the meeting? And not only that, I could strengthen my question to, what did women scientists do at Mount Wilson Observatory during the early years? So a bit more photographs from Waterman Hase's album. So this is the old museum building. It's actually here. It's not the same building. This was built in 1909. It was torn down in 1936, and this current structure, a much larger, nicer museum, was built where we are today. So this was a smaller building, but same location. And we see men talking during the break, and they are probably looking up at the 150-foot solar telescope, which is on the other side. And we have the picture of the woman resting. So from these, we could see that there were men and women, and sometimes they kept to themselves, sometimes they mingled with each other. They would carry on discussions about the meetings or scientific things. Maybe they would talk about the travels or other meetings. And Edward Pickering, that we see here, he kept a diary, and he noted how incredibly hot it was traveling across from Boston to Pasadena in August, and how the ride up the trail of Mount Wilson was so frightening, and it was the dustiest ride of his life. And up here on Mount Wilson, it was primitive but beautiful, comfortable, as well as being very dusty, and water was scarce. So water was scarce 100 years ago, just as it is today. And people like Larry Webster or Steve Padilla will most likely be able to tell you where the pictures were taken. So maybe you will get a chance to ask them, like, where were these photographs taken? And photographs form an important research toolkit for the historian. So the originals of the Phoebe Waterman Hase's photograph are in the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. So in the olden days, I would have to travel to D.C. and request to look at them. But thankfully, they digitized the entire photo album, and they made it available on internet. So I was able to just click and look it up at home. And Larry Webster told me about his photo album. He has been a great expert, and I could ask him about so many things about this place, and he would give me all the answers. So I really thank him for pointing out the existence of this album, because it really added an extra perspective to my research. So this is Mount Wilson Observatory today, and some of us are more familiar with this place than others, but we've all seen parts of the place already as we came up here, and hopefully we will see more and look through the 60-inch and the 100-inch telescope. So the place was founded in 1904 officially, and by 1910, most of the things were in place. So first, the snow telescope, the long white structure that's somewhere over there, was how it looked like in 1905. The next one that was up was actually a 60-inch telescope. This was starting to be being built in 1905, 1906, and it was scientifically operational in around 1908. So Hale got the money to build move the snow telescope, which was originally at Yerkes Observatory near Chicago, to bring this over and to get this 60-inch reflector telescope built. Then he obtained more money to build a 60-foot tower telescope, which was more or less complete in 1907. Then he got additional funds to build the 150-foot telescope tower, and by the time of this international meeting in August 1910, this was more or less functional. So this was how it looked like in October, so 2 months after the meeting. And in 1910, this wasn't up there, up on the mountain, but Hale did get money. He got donations from the industrialist John D. Hooker to get the mirror built. And he also got money from Carnegie Institution of Washington, which was the main patron of this observatory. So there was the 100-inch mirror grinding machine down in Pasadena. And you may be able to see there's a small child sitting on a chair. So this was put up there for scale. And in some websites, they say Phoebe Waterman took the photograph, but I haven't been able to positively verify it. Okay. So in the story, the founding of Mount Wilson Observatory, so we have that Hale, which we see here. He founded Yerkes Observatory. It started in 1891, actually. That's the same year Amos Troop founded Troop University, which eventually became Caltech in Pasadena. And Yerkes Observatory was inaugurated in 1897, and these are some of the main staff. So he was settled in Chicago, but he wasn't very happy with the situation there because, well, the observation conditions in southern Wisconsin is not so great compared to out here in California. And he didn't have a very good patron there. Charles Yerkes, after the observatory was inaugurated, became an unreliable source of funding. And the University of Chicago, the president, William Rainey Harper, was phenomenally successful in raising money to rebuild the university. And he basically depleted all the potential patrons who can support the astronomical observatory. So he didn't get much funding, and the observation condition is not good. So in 1904, he moved to Mount Wilson here. And the usual story is, first he brought out Ferdinand Ellerman, whom you can see in the photograph here. And Hale and Ellerman worked together to produce stunning solar photographs to convince the people at Carnegie Institution of Washington that they should reconsider funding this observatory up at Mount Wilson. He succeeded in getting sufficiently a large sum of money to bring out the solar telescope at Yerkes Observatory that's known as the Snow Telescope. So after he got the money, he brought George Ritchie, who is also photographed here, and Walter Adams, who was a junior assistant astronomer at Yerkes at the time. And those two worked, and George Ritchie also brought out Francis Pease. So we usually have Hale, Ellerman, Ritchie, Adams, Pease as the pioneers of Mount Wilson Observatory, and we usually remember their names. So my question is, where are the women scientists, and what did the women scientists do at Mount Wilson Observatory? So today, and there were more than three, but I'm going to just focus mainly on Louise Ware, Jennie Belle Lasby, and a little on Phoebe Waterman. Okay, so that small photograph of Louise Ware is from this picture. And you might have seen this on the Mount Wilson Observatory website. And there, aside from this, there's also another one where they list all the names of the people taken in this picture. And that was the only positive assertion I have that this is Louise Ware. So this is the only photograph I have of her at the moment where I can positively identify she's Louise Ware, and I hope, and I'm pretty sure I will find more. She was the first woman scientist employed at Mount Wilson. She was employed in 1906 July, and she worked here until 1942. And she was born in Auburn, New York, near the Finger Lakes in 1875, attended Vassar College, graduated in 1900. She first taught a high school in upstate New York in a town named Batavia for a year or so, and then she became a computer at Yerkes Observatory in 1902. So Louise Ware's relationship with astronomy, George Ellery Hale, starts at Yerkes Observatory. And there she worked with an assistant astronomer. He's also pictured here in the other photograph of Yerkes astronomers I showed you, named Frank Schlesinger. And there she worked on positional astronomy, so trying to find the stellar parallax. So this is where when a star is nearby Earth, sufficiently close enough, against the background of distant stars. If the Earth is here, we see the star somewhere here, and 6 months later we will see the star appearing to move here. So these are actually very tiny, detailed, minute measurements. And this is not the photographic plate they used. I was trying to look for one that Frank Schlesinger took, and I couldn't find it. But this will be similar to what Schlesinger and Ware would have looked at. So just a visual photograph, direct photography of stars, and you'll be trying to identify the position of the stars using something called a comparator. So this was made by a company called, William Gardner and Company. They were located in Chicago at this time. So this company still exists, and they're operational out of the suburban Chicago area today. At that time, they were close to the University of Chicago, and they specialized in making these, it's called a comparator, or like a microscope to determine the position of certain things, in very, very in minute detail. So this is the machine used at Yerkes Observatory. So you put your photographic plate here, like this here, and then you determine the position of each stars. So both Schlesinger and Ware observed these photographic plates. But in the final publication, which was published in Astrophysical Journal, which was the premier scientific journal for astrophysics, which was also founded by George Ellery Hale, only Frank Schlesinger's name is on as the author list. And in the paper, he does mention that he and Louise Ware carried out the measurements, but she's not acknowledged or thanked. She's just like there as a person who took the measurements. But Louise Ware must have been very competent at the least, and most likely extremely good at her work. Because when Yerkes Observatory ran into financial trouble later on, Hale was advising the acting director, Edwin Frost, to let go of the instrument maker, who's a man, and keep Louise Ware, who's a woman, computer. She was far more valuable to keep than an instrument maker. And he was very interested in having her. So despite her working on positional astronomy and Mount Wilson Observatory going to be dedicated to astrophysical work, he wanted to bring her over to Mount Wilson. So as soon as he got the big funding to found Mount Wilson Observatory, he wrote to Ware asking if she's interested in coming out to Mount Wilson, Pasadena and work. She said yes, but she needs to finish her work with Frank Schlesinger in Yerkes, but she would love to come out. And also at Mount Wilson, Hale and others had to build the telescopes so they can carry out the observations. So the computing division formed a bit later than December 1904. So eventually she came out in July of 1906, and she worked with Hale on determining how the sun rotates by observing a thing called flocculi. So if you look at the sun through a certain wavelength, there's a very bright, intense areas surrounding the sunspots, and these were called flocculi at the turn of the 20th century. So what was going on was Ferdinand Ellerman used the SNO telescope out there to do all the observations. He took all the photographic measurements up at Mount Wilson, and then he would bring all the photographic plates down to Pasadena into the office where Louise Ware was. And in the office, she would also use a telescope, but she's not, when we say somebody is using a telescope to do astronomy, we have this image of a lone astronomer at night looking through the telescope in solitary silence. But in Ware's case, she was at daytime, in a crowded office surrounded by photographic stacks of photographic plates, and she was using something like this to get the position of these things here. So she would sit here and look through this stereoscopic telescope. It's called a heliomicrometer that was invented by Hale and his associates when he was at Yerkes Observatory, and Hale brought this over to Mount Wilson. So in one of the telescopes, you will put the photographic plate that Ellerman took, and through the other you will look at the globe, and the point is you superimpose this to this, and then you use the telescope to read off the position. This was far faster, more efficient than using a comparator to get the positions. So Ware was producing like positions of flocculi after flocculi. So Element took a total of 71 photographic plates, and Ware ended up measuring over 2,000 points. Though this was way faster and more convenient, efficient than actually like looking at this place with the comparator, it was still difficult measurements. And it wasn't really routine either, because each photographic plate was different. The flocculi not only rotated with the sun, it also changed how it was like. So she had to be really aware and first determine what is a flocculi. And each plate was so different. She had to also keep track that, oh, this is the same flocculi, or this is a new flocculi. So there were many things to take into account, and she did the work very competently. However, in the final publication in Astrophysical Journal, we only see George Ellery Hale as the author. Ferdinand Element and Louise Ware are acknowledged that they did the observation and the measurement of the plates, but Hale is the author of this paper. So from this, he built his reputation as a solar astrophysicist. And when we look for papers, we would very likely remember Hale, the solar astrophysicist, but we would tend to forget that Element and Ware also contributed to the work. And it seemed that in the work and like how the paper was written, Hale most likely regarded Ware as a technician who carried out the routine but complicated and essential measurements. It doesn't seem that he carried out any scientific discussions with her. But not all men astronomers regarded women computers that way. And the person Louise Ware later worked on and worked longest was Charles St. John, treated her otherwise. So Louise Ware worked closely with Charles St. John for most of her career at Mount Wilson Observatory. And the first work they did together was determining the absolute value of the various solar wavelength measurements. So this work came up during the 1910 International Union for Cooperation in Solar Research conference. So instruments were getting increasingly sophisticated, and astrophysicists were finding that they needed a more accurate reference of the wavelength value of the solar spectral lines when they were measuring, like really, really refined values. And what St. John found was that previously published values that solar astronomers were using, so they make spectrum photographs of the sun, and they say, identify, oh, it's this wave, so this element, that element. They were slightly incorrect, and this slight discrepancy was getting more and more serious. So he proposed that they need to make a correction to this, and the work required meticulous measurement of the spectral lines, something that a highly accomplished computer like Ware would feel at ease to carry out. So what happened was they both measured spectral lines, and I'm conjecturing that only the men astronomer took the actual photographs of the sun, and they also had to compare laboratory measurements of various elements. And both St. John and Ware carried out the determining where these spectral lines were, something like here. So determining what is this precise position. So in the paper, we continuously see that St. John and Ware did both works, and they were compared to make sure there was no human error there. And they were even considering differences coming from measurements carried out here in the summit of Mount Wilson and measurements carried out in Pasadena down in the valley, and they did find differences. So they had to account for all of that. So throughout the series of papers St. John and Ware wrote, it looks like St. John considered Ware as a colleague that he carried out scientific discussions with. So throughout the publication, they use we and us instead of I and Miss Ware, which is what some of the astronomers did. So even if there are co-authors that will say, I did this, and then Miss so-and-so did that. But in all their publications, they use us and we. And it's possible that St. John, who's known to be a very kind, nice person, he was very generous in including Ware, and that since they're co-authors, the editor of Astrophysical Journal decided to have some writing consistency. But even in this scenario, the authors, they know that authorship is important in gaining prominence. So it's likely that they know that from the author list that both people were contributing to the work. And also these were technical papers. So it also makes sense that somebody who's an expert in measuring lines would also feature as a scientific equal to an astronomer. So these example of what Ware did with St. John, it can highlight the freedom and the limitations women scientists faced when they were hired as computers. The work they did and how they did and what they can do really depended on the supervisor's inclination. If the supervisor was more open to listening to their opinion, they would have more freedom in scientific input, not just doing calculations. But on the other hand, if the supervisors just wanted them to carry out strict calculations, they had to do that. And in highlighting the limitations, so St. John wrote these papers with Ware, but at the same time, he, as a staff astronomer, was free to carry out other research. So at the same time, he was carrying out the work from 1912 to 1922. The theory of general relativity came out, and St. John also spent some time investigating possible signs of general relativity in the solar spectrum. And he became famous for that. So this is where we see that. And when Albert Einstein visited Pasadena and Mount Wilson Observatory in 1931, we see lots of photographs of Charles St. John with Albert Einstein discussing. So St. John had the freedom to carry out any research he wanted. Ware might have been as accomplished as St. John, but she was limited to the work assigned to her. So Ware stayed on as a computer until 1942, and throughout the time it seems she was well liked and respected by her colleagues. And social cultural compatibility was a very important factor amongst the computers because they were working long hours in a confined office space. They typically work from 8 to noon and 1 to 4:30 on weekdays and 8 to noon on Saturdays, so long hours. And when they were looking for computers, Frederick Sears, one of the astronomers at Mount Wilson, who was head of the computing division from 1909, emphasized that the person they're going to hire had to have astronomical ability and had to have a personality that was congenial and companionable person. So it wouldn't do to have somebody who didn't get along with others. They were really looking for a academically competent as well as socially compatible people. And when Ware was away from Pasadena for personal health reasons, there's a letter written by one of the women saying, she misses Ware and can't wait until she comes back. So when she retired in 1942, she was the 4th longest person to be hired at Mount Wilson during the early days. The other 3 are Walter Adams, Harold Babcock, another solar astrophysicist, and actually Cora Burwell, who was the 4th computer hired at Mount Wilson. But she stayed on for a very long time, and after retiring from Mount Wilson, this is 1942, and she was very highly skilled. So they hired her at Caltech to work on war efforts. And she stayed there until 1945. And she continued living, she never married. She lived in Pasadena and passed away in 1953. And this is from a Vassar questionnaire that was sent to her in 1950. And it's an answer to a question they asked. Give your reasons why you would or would not major in the same field. And she replied, my course in college opened a way for work which I have enjoyed, in which I have had a measure of usefulness, and which associations have been pleasant and stimulating to growth. I can't think of any major changes I could have made in choosing my course that would have proved better in view of my own limitations. So I found this very touching and very humbling from somebody who worked continuously with high standards for decades in astronomy. So I moved to Jennie Belle Lasby. She's the third woman scientist hired at Mount Wilson after Louise Ware and another woman scientist named Ruth Smith. So she came to Mount Wilson in October 1906, and she was born in Northfield, Minnesota in 1882. I believe, 1882. She graduated from Carleton College, that's in Minnesota, and then went east to attend Mount Holyoke College. She got her Master's of Science degree there in 1906, and it's a very small cohort of graduate students, just 4. So when she was hired at Mount Wilson, she actually had a higher academic degree than George Ellery Hale. Hale had his Bachelor of Science degree from MIT, and that's actually the end of his official formal academic education. So I have a picture of Lasby here, and this came by another chance. So collaborations and assistance can come in various forms. So there are many pictures of women, so I had a hunch who might Lasby be, but there was no smoking gun, 100% affirmative confirmation. And this is from a photo album of an astronomer named John Plaskett. It's at the Huntington Library. It's digitized, so you can find this photo album in the Huntington Digital Library website. And there it says Miss Lasby is in one of the photographs. So there are a number of women. So I was looking at all the women there thinking, who could she be? And I looked at this, and then my daughter found a writing on this. So I don't have the actual copy. Again, this is a digitized copy. I only have my computer screen to look at. So she asked me, what is this writing? What does it say, Miss Lasby? And indeed it did. So I had a positive confirmation that this person standing at the corner is Miss Lasby. And in the photo album of Phoebe Waterman, taken at the same meeting. Oh, sorry, so by the way, this was taken in 1910, International Union for Cooperation in Solar Research, the same conference. So in the photo album of Phoebe Waterman, we have this photograph. So I think I know who this person is. I don't know who these other 2 are, but this person is definitely this person. She's wearing the same dress, she has glasses, she's holding the same box here. So again, yay! Thanks to my daughter assistant, we got a confirmation. So I'm going yes, I finally have a photo of Lasby. And then furthermore, in Phoebe Waterman's photo album, she have inscriptions of names taken on Mount Wilson. So this is actually at a place called Captine Cottage. So the Chara people here would know very well. So it says, this is P, Jess, Ruth, HB, and Nan. So this person is Lasby, but she's Jennie Belle Lasby. So instead of calling each other by their formal given name, it seems these computers were very close with each other, and they had close social interactions, and they were calling each other by their nicknames. And we also strongly suspect Ruth is not Ruth Smith. It's most likely Cora Burwell, based on other photographs. So they were giving each other nicknames, or maybe they already had a nickname when they came to work at Mount Wilson. So this was an exciting slice of how the computers worked and interacted with each other at Mount Wilson. So throughout her stay at Mount Wilson Observatory, Lasby worked mostly with Walter Adams, and she worked exclusively on spectrograms. So she looked at spectrums, first of the sun, and later of the stars when the 60-inch telescope got into operation. And the first work she did was so this was another work of trying to determine how the sun rotated. So Hale had this approach of using direct photography, looking at how things move across the sun. As the sun rotated. Adams took our approach of taking spectrograms, looking at the spectrum and calculating the radial velocity. So when the sun rotates, we can, especially towards the edge of the sun, we can see whether the sun is moving towards us or away from us, and we can estimate the speed of the rotation. And this is what the two were trying to do. He took a series of photographs, and that itself was a technological feat. So what did he do? So he had to take multiple exposures along different solar latitudes for each photographic plate, and he had to take care not to distort the position of the photographic plate, maintain the same level of brightness for each exposure. And between 1906 May and 1907 June, Adams made 44 plates, each with an average of six exposures. And then he and Lasby measured the spectrum. And the calculation was very complicated. So using these lines, Lasby first calculated the solar latitude for each spectrum, and then she obtained the radial velocity for 20 spectral lines per exposure. So for each exposure, you have to measure 20 places. And then using a machine called a comparator, which is similar to what Louise Ware used at Yerkes to get the stellar parallax measurement, she would get the positions of the line. So this is about 18 inches across. It's wide enough to hold an 18-inch plate. And this was made specifically to be used at Mount Wilson. So astronomers could put in an order saying, we want this machine to hold certain dimensions of photographic plates. So this is actually the one Adams used. It was made at the Gartner Company, and Lasby used a similar machine that was made in Germany. So with two measurements, they can be sure that there's no systematic error coming from different machines or different people. And because this solar rotation measurement using spectrum was a new method, it was doubly important to have this check-in process. And indeed, years later, people like John Plaskett would write to Adams asking about the measurement. Are you sure you double-check this? And so on. So this measurement was important in the early 1900s for scientists to understand how the sun rotated. And when Adams published the results, she doesn't feature as co-author, so Adams was the single author for these papers, but he did something unusual in thanking Lasby in the papers. So when you read papers from the early 1900s, it was pretty standard for astronomers to say, so-and-so did the reductions, so-and-so took the photographic plates, if they didn't do it by themselves. But in two of the papers, Adams thanked Lasby, saying she thanks Lasby for her most efficient performance of the exacting work involved in the measurement and reduction of the large number of plates. And in another paper a year later, he writes, I wish to express my appreciation to Miss Lasby for her careful and accurate measurement of the majority of the plates included in this discussion. So he went really out of the way to thank Miss Lasby for her contribution to the work. And again, the eventual aim of this paper is to see how the sun rotated, but it was an immensely technical paper. And their work accumulated in this 100-and-something page publication done by the Carnegie Institution of Washington and published in 1911. So the authorship is a bit strange. It says by Walter S. Adams, assisted by Jennie Belle Lasby. So it's not co-author, not really equal, but they do acknowledge Lasby as author. And usually it was customary for the Carnegie publications to send 10 complimentary copies of this paper to the author. So they sent it to Adams, and then Adams writes to the president of the Carnegie Institution of Washington, Robert Woodward, saying, well, can I also have copies for Miss Lasby? So he also went out of the way to request copies. And then they replied, okay, it's not customary, but we will send you 5 complimentary copies for Miss Lasby's use. So, yeah, it was like that 100 years ago. Yes. And she did something unusual. So she did publish some papers of her own. So based on this work done on solar rotation, she publishes a single author paper called the Spectroscopic Observations of the Rotation of the Sun, so same topic, but in a different journal, Popular Astronomy. So Astrophysical Journal, this Carnegie publication, was geared more towards professional astronomers, whereas, or astrophysicists, and whereas Popular Astronomy was geared more towards astronomers who didn't really particularly care for the newfangled astrophysics, where you had to deal with spectrum and deal more with physics. It was also geared towards an amateur audience. So the audience for Astrophysical Journal and Popular Astronomy, they do overlap, but they also cover different ranges. And in this publication, Lasby really summarized in less than 20 pages, which is enormously long, lengthy article. So it may not be an original research, as in the sense that this is a completely different research from what Adams published and what was published here. But she did do a work that was important too. She made it more accessible to a wider range of audience. And she also went on to do other unexpected things, things we won't expect from a woman computer who would be just a subordinate. She's the first woman to observe with the 60-inch reflector telescope. And again, it's also with mixed feelings. So this is from the telescope logbook that's at the Huntington Library. And on May 29th, 1912, this is the date, and the second column is the observer. May 29th, we have Adams and Lasby, and they observed for a few days here. So this is the first instance where it's recorded that a woman used the 60-inch reflector telescope. But as we can see, Lasby never observed by herself. She was always with Adams or another astronomer named Arnold Kohlschutter. And it's in the official reports, it's mentioned that she assisted in the observations rather than saying she carried out observations. But she must have been competent at the least, because she observed for 53 nights total between May 1912 and April 1914. And at this time, 1912, Walter Adams was in charge of assigning telescope time. He was doing most of the day-to-day operation and most familiar with the telescopes and the observatory. So if Lasby, let's say, wasn't good, or she made a mess or she caused trouble with the observations, it's pretty sure that he wouldn't let her carry out these observations after the first few nights. But it continued for 53 nights overall. So at the least, she must have been competent. And she was the only woman to have used the 60-inch reflector until Margaret Harwood, who was director of the Maria Mitchell Observatory, came here, visited Mount Wilson to observe in 1924. And in that case, she was recorded as a sole observer. For Lasby, when she was up here to observe, she couldn't stay at the monastery because that dormitory was only for men. So she most likely stayed at the Mount Wilson Hotel or one of the other cottages. And that proved an additional logistical difficulty because the monastery, as you know, is well secluded. It's a very convenient, nice place for somebody who spent the entire night awake, sleeping during daytime. It's quiet. They have housekeeping done for you. So all you need to do is come up to the mountain, get your things ready, observe. You finish observing, you clean up, you come back, you sleep. While you eat, you sleep, you get up and you repeat. if you stay at one of the cottages, there was no such thing done. You had to like take care of your own housekeeping, get your own food, and there are like tourists that's constantly going back and forth. It's noisy, so you won't be able to get sufficient rest. So there was a difference between men observer and woman observer. And sadly for Mount Wilson Observatory, this persisted until the late 1940s, when women astronomers applied to observe at Mount Wilson. The standard reply given by astronomers was, there's no room, there's no place for you to stay up, so sadly we can't let you observe. And when they finally did, in the late 1940s and 50s, women still couldn't stay at the monastery. They stayed in one of the cottages, and they complained about the noise. They complained that housekeeping is not done for them, so even the tired state, they have to clean the rooms themselves. Nowadays, there's no such thing, so we did make improvements since then. So Lasby, she made her own publications. She observed, but she was like still limited in what she could do, even though Walter Adams was very accommodating, and he was more inclusive and open to women and carried out scientific discussions with them. So she took a leave of absence in 1914, went to Germany, most likely to like carry out research, but then World War I started, so she was forced to return to the US. She spent the wartime at Carleton College as a librarian and computer. And then after the war, she came back to Southern California. She taught astronomy and history at Santa Ana College in Orange County. And she kept ties with Mount Wilson Observatory, so she would bring her students here to visit the 60-inch telescope and also like meet up with Adams and her old colleagues who are still here. And for those of you living near Santa Ana, you might have known the planetarium in the college. It's named Tessman Planetarium after Jennie Lasby. She married, what's his full name? Sorry. In 1929, she married Heinrich Arnold Johannes Tessman, who was an astronomer. So she became Jennie Lasby Tessman. And she continued to teach at Santa Ana College until her retirement in 1946. And the Tessman Planetarium recently underwent an extensive renovation, and this is what it looks like today. And we have the Tessman Planetarium in commemoration of Jennie Lasby Tessman. So again, a different trajectory from Louise Ware. She tried to explore many different channels, but the playing field was very, very uneven. So the things you could do was different from men astronomers, and it was limited. But we can imagine what she might have done today if she were an astronomer 100 years later. The last example I'm going to bring up is Phoebe Waterman. And she didn't stay for that long at Mount Wilson Observatory, but I really wanted to include her story because of her beautiful photo album, and also her career as an astronomer is really fascinating and also tragic in some ways. So she was born in 1882, and she attended Vassar College from 1900, so just when after Louise Ware graduated. And she did her Bachelor's of Science degree there. She stayed on and completed her Master of Science degree in 1908. And after getting her Master of Science, she went on to teach in high school, and she didn't like it. So she said, okay, let me try my hands at computing. So she wrote to her Vassar professors, Mary Whitney and Caroline Furness, and asked where can I apply for a computer job? And she was really good in her studies. So Whitney and Furness, who were the two professors at Vassar, recommended her to Mount Wilson Observatory, and she was hired in July of 1909. And Vassar College was a place where women who were interested in astronomy could get a degree. And those two professors, Whitney and Furness, were like being constantly asked by the students, can you write a letter of recommendation for me? Or astronomers from observatories like Mount Wilson or Lick or Yerkes would write to those two saying like, who are your good students? Like, do you think this person is good? Who would you recommend? Or can you recommend a good student of yours? So she came to Mount Wilson, and based on the photo album of hers, it seems she led a very like socially and intellectually active life. And she was also frustrated at the limitations she faced. So when she arrived, Mount Wilson was growing, and Walter Adams resigned from the computing division. He was more involved in other aspects of the observatory, and Frederick Sears was hired to take over the computing division. So we have a number of photographs from that time. So again, we have the 5 computers who seem to be having an enjoyable time at the conference. And at that conference, she appeared to went up in the elevator, or what was called the bucket, of the 150-foot tower. This wouldn't be allowed today, but so this must be one of the perks 100 years ago. You can actually like sit in the bucket and go up 150 feet up. So she was very frustrated at what she could do at Mount Wilson. So she wrote to her professor like complaining about this. And unlike Jennie Lasby, who tried to like seek many channels, like publishing articles or trying to observe, she chose another way, which was going for a PhD. So she applied to UC Berkeley because it was free at the time. And her coursework she did as a Master's of Science at FASA was so good. William Campbell, who was the director at Lick Observatory, recommended that like they accept her immediately. So she starts her graduate career in the summer of 1911, and these are her classmates when they got their PhD in the summer of 1913. So there's Phoebe Waterman here, and there's another woman, Estelle Glancy. They were classmates as well as roommates. And as a student, like pursuing a PhD at UC Berkeley, they had ties with Lick Observatory, and she was able to observe with the 36-inch refractor at Lick. So she was so happy there, saying, oh, I can like do my own observations, I can reduce my data. And she became a doctor in 1913, and then she was wondering what she would do afterwards. And she persuaded her classmate, roommate, to apply to the Argentine National Observatory in Cordoba. Lick Observatory astronomer Charles Perrine was the director at that time, and he accepted both women. You can come and observe here. So she and Estelle, so Phoebe Waterman and Estelle Glancy sailed to Argentina from New York in September 1913. And this is what they found in Cordoba. It was still, like, there was an observatory, and they were putting up a dome for a new astrographic telescope. And there she was faced with social restrictions again. The observatory didn't allow a woman to stay there overnight. So she and Estelle were wondering, like, how do we do observations? So one way they tried to get around was they would get up very early in the morning. So technically they're not staying overnight. They're just going to the observatory early in the morning. And if the observation conditions are good, they can carry out some observations then. But she was very frustrated at what she couldn't do. Like, if she were a man, she can do so many things, and just because of gender, she was restricted at what she could do. So after less than 3 months, she quits, and she marries somebody she met on the way to Argentina, Otto Haas. And Estelle Glancy actually stayed on, and she actually stayed on in science and went into optics. At that time, it wasn't like you married, you quit your job. It wasn't like as black and white as that. But it was also expected that if women marry, they will put their family first, and it was usually expected of them to quit their jobs. Not all women did. We have other counterexamples of married women continuing to work, but there was that social expectation. So Phoebe Waterman finished her professional astronomical career 3 months after she got her PhD, and her advisors, at Vassar, Whitney and Furness, as well as William Campbell at Lick Observatory, were not so happy with her decision. They worried that it might make other women candidates fare badly, saying, look at this example, like we trained Phoebe Waterman, who was brilliant, and look what happened to her after she graduated. So they really were worried that that would happen to other women. But she was continuously interested in astronomy, and she made observations for variable stars, and she did keep a telescope, and you can find more about her if you search for Melissa Joskow, Smithsonian Magazine, Phoebe Waterman. She wrote a very nice article about Phoebe Waterman Haas and her subsequent career. But as an astronomer 100 years later, like thinking back to the limitations, the extremely uneven playing ground that these women faced and what they did, even getting a PhD seemed like something amazing, like thinking what they had to go through. So one of her classmates who got the PhD at the same time was Paul Merrill, who's pictured here. So after graduation, he worked at University of Michigan for 3 years as a lecturer, was involved in the war effort, and came to Mount Wilson Observatory in 1919 as staff astronomer, and he stayed here until his retirement for many decades. So in 1945, after the war, he writes a postcard to Phoebe Waterman Haas saying, "Many thanks for your kind note. The Lick days seem far away now, but awfully good to look back to. The spectrograph pays little attention to the valley lights. Best wishes, Paul W.M." So again, there are many individuals, they make different choices, but the social cultural conventions and restrictions can really play a role in what these people can do and what choices they have to make. Okay, so to wrap up, Mount Wilson Observatory definitely owes to George Ellery Hale. He was the one who proposed there should be a dedicated observatory for solar astrophysics, and maybe a place at the same place that can test this new large reflector telescopes. That's how it started. He talked with the people with money and political connections. He was able to persuade the Carnegie Institution of Washington people to give money to found this place. At the same time, we have to remember the people who worked with Hale. So it wasn't Hale alone who did everything, who made this observatory famous worldwide. It was people such as Ellerman, Adams, Ritchie, Pease, who worked, especially in the early days, to produce proof that this place is indeed a very good place to carry out solar observations and later stellar observations. So Ellerman was a very good photographer, as well as he was able to fix everything, almost. Adams was a superb astronomer. He loved observing. He was very good at analysis. Like Hale needed these people. And Ritchie and Pease were superb instrument makers. It was their work that made the 60-inch and the 100-inch mirrors. But not only these men, when we say the Mount Wilson Observatory astronomers, we need to remember women such as Louise Ware, Jennie Lasby, and Phoebe Waterman. When we say Mount Wilson Observatory was wonderful, we had amazing astronomers who contributed to making this place wonderful. And it's not only them. When we look at the pictures, there are really many people. So in this photo, there's not only astronomers, there are also some technicians, engineers who happen to be down in Santa Barbara Street office that day. There are also many women computers. There's also stenographers who worked. And And this is actually Harold Babcock and Horace Babcock, who was a child and later became an astronomer here. So we see many people who contributed to upkeeping this place, carrying out research, make sure Mount Wilson Observatory can do good work. So what I get out from here is that, well, first of all, there were indeed women scientists at Mount Wilson Observatory who did science. That itself was like such a great finding for me. I was very happy. And that it's not a hero or a heroine narrative. It's not that, oh, I found this woman scientist, and she's the one who actually did all the classification work or all the spectral solar rotation work. It's not really that. So rather than putting women scientists up on a pedestal or saying, oh, these women were just drudges, they did what they were told, it's a more complex story. Just as there were like many men astronomers, and they all vary in their personalities, their roles. Like Ferdinand Ellerman and Walter Adams, Harold Babcock, Charles St. John, they are different persons. And other than saying they were very hardworking astronomers, we can't really like lump them into one and just try to describe them. It's the same for these women. They have different personalities, they had different trajectories, who faced an extremely uneven playing field. And in that very uneven playing field, they tried to see what would work out for them and how they can stay in the field, or when they got frustrated, they were forced to leave. And what I see from here is I'm a beneficiary of these women's work. So when I was in undergrad and graduate school and postdoc later on, I hardly faced discrimination, like direct discrimination, whereas my advisor's generation, women scientists, did. But it doesn't mean that the playing field is completely equal yet, but it came a long way from 100 years ago. And what we learned from the stories of these women is diversity, inclusivity in telling a story of science makes the thing far richer. It's more complete. We see the various contributions that comes into like what makes scientific knowledge. And I think that's the biggest thing I got out of studying the lives of these wonderful women. Okay, yeah, thank you.